I slammed the front door and froze. Voices in the upscale hotel's corridor were laughing like they'd already won, and I watched it all on my feed. I stood there in the hallway for a beat, phone glowing in my hand, seeing Lauren, wife, and Eric, lover, through the glass of room 3211, cozy and whispering like conspirators swapping a secret handshake. Her bracelet flashed under the sweet light, diamonds mocking me, and Eric said, "After the divorce, they'll understand." Lauren giggled, "My kids barely knew me." Those words hit like a punch. I felt the air go thin and the floor drop out from under me because 8 years of marriage and a decade of building a company were suddenly on the edge of a cliff. I remember the ridiculous little things I did to make a life because they added up. The ring I saved for, the school tour, the time I waited in a freezing car for Connor's midnight fever to break. I replayed those memories on the walk to my car, switching camera angles on the feed like flipping through old photos that suddenly had fingerprints all over them. I thought about how many times I'd stayed late to secure a contract, how many Saturdays I'd missed for client crises, and how I'd come home tired but thinking I did it all for them. Watching Lauren and Eric there, talking like they'd already cashed out on the life they'd been stealing, felt like watching my own trial without a judge. My hands weren't steady, but training kicked in, military habit, the way you breathe while you collect facts. I didn't storm the room or slap hands on a table. I sat in my truck and watched, listening for names and details. They spoke fast and wastefully, like men who assume nothing will ever touch them. Eric unrolled a timeline, talking about papers and witnesses and timing that mapped exactly to the custody filing Lauren had planned. She laughed about the judge being on our side, the implication unmistakable, a court bent by reputation and quiet pressure. He dropped numbers casually, $287,000 here, $401,000 moved there, things you say when you believe you're already untouchable. My stomach turned over. This wasn't passion, this was a ledger. I made a decision then to be surgical. I thought about the cameras I'd planted months ago, the backups I'd kept in a fireproof safe under a stack of old payrolls. I thought about the time I'd sat with a client whose board was getting hacked and how that client trusted me to build a defense. If they were planning to take my company and my kids, I'd do the same thing to their plan, unmask it piece by piece. I pulled files, timestamped things, mapped bank transfers against hotel stays and GPS pings. Every lie they'd told overlapped in ways you can't fake. The bracelet purchased on a card the family didn't own, the offshore accounts Eric had opened under shell names, the receipts that reappeared when I ran them through shadow archives. I remember the sudden cold when I found the old sealed case file about the 2009 crash tied to the Kennards. That's when the scale of this went beyond just me. I'd married into a family that knew how to bury trouble and keep it underpoliced and underreported, a family that used influence as currency. The documents showed the decisions, the favors, the calls placed when witnesses started to speak. I felt a mix of righteous anger and the practical steadiness of someone who knows how to turn information into leverage. I didn't want to destroy anyone out of spite. I wanted to stop them from destroying my kids and the people who depended on my company. So I set the trap the way I'd trained, gather more, wait for them to move, and then hit the moment when their arrogance made them sloppy. I let them plan and celebrate. I let Eric make that stupid phone mistake that would give me his offshore trails. I let Lauren breathe her conspiracies aloud in places her arrogance made her think were private. I logged everything. I rebuilt deleted folders. I slid copies of damning emails into my own secure cloud and wrote notes to myself like a sane man who needed to remember timelines and alibis for when the lawyers came sniffing. While watching them together, I kept thinking about two main things, the kids and the company. Connor and Lily were the real yardstick for every choice I'd make. Carter's Shield was more than a business. People's safety and livelihoods depended on my being steady and right. If I snapped and made a scene, I'd give them what they wanted, a narrative of a broken veteran, unstable and vindictive. I wasn't going to hand them that story. My plan was to cut the rope quietly, expose the theft, force the truth into daylight where courts and prosecutors could see it without the Kennard sheen. When Eric mouthed a plan about a plane ticket and a bank transfer, I took a picture of the screen with my phone and sent it to a contact at the Financial Crimes Unit. Old favors and real proof. I hit record on audio feeds and copied video to multiple drives. I made the kind of cold choices that feel like betrayal and like salvation at the same time. I was betraying the life I thought I had for the sake of the life I needed to protect. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I traced every wire, every signature, every late-night transfer until the map of their plan smelled like rust and bad faith. By dawn, their laughter had faded on the feed and the suite was quiet, but I wasn't calmer. I sat in my driveway and let the sun come up on a plan I had to carry out piece by piece. Revenge isn't a word I use much. What I wanted was justice and safety for the kids. I told myself then out loud, you don't burn the house down, you show the fire was set. That's what I meant to do. I would not let greed and influence rewrite the story of my family. I am a man who notices patterns. That's what 14 years in military intelligence does to you, makes you trained to see the line through the mess. After the military, I started Carter Shield Security with a laptop and $65,000, and I built it the slow way, long hours, calls at 2 in the morning, pitching until people listened. I don't tell that to win sympathy. I tell it because the same habit that found threats in a crowd helped me find the scenes that later mattered in my own house. Patterns are quiet until they're a scream, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. I met Lauren, wife, at a Boston Children's Coalition gala when I was 36 and she was 31, and we moved fast in a way that felt honest to me. We had elegant dinners that tasted like futures, and she liked the finer things in a way that matched her family's world. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. I bought a $21,000 engagement ring because I wanted a ring that meant permanence, and we spent nearly $95,000 on a wedding with 220 people because I wanted our beginning to be solid and obvious. We bought a house in South Shore, leased 2 SUVs, took trips where the conversations were mostly about the next hotel or restaurant. I paid for stability, she enjoyed the lifestyle, and for a while the two things looked like they fit. I kept thinking of us as a team because that's how I'd always worked: watch, check, plan, protect. In business, I learned to read people fast: investors who overpromised, clients who whispered about legal trouble, partners who wanted a slice without the work. I used the same lens at home, believing affection plus effort equaled security. The kids came and changed everything differently than we expected, Connor and Lily arriving 9 minutes apart, a chaos that rerouted sleep and plans but gave me a steady center. I doubled down on work because I wanted to give them schools and time. I thought my sacrifices were buying the life they deserved. I didn't see those sacrifices being framed behind my back as weakness. When you build a company from a laptop and a single retainer, you learn the currency of loyalty. Carter Shield grew because I hired people who believed in the mission, not the glamour. We kept contracts by being quiet and effective, showing up when things got ugly. That taught me to trust competence over charm, to value actions more than speeches. With Lauren, it seemed the opposite for a while. She loved social proof, events, and the ease of being known. I liked that part of her. It made me feel like my world had expanded. I didn't notice charm being used as a tool until it was already cutting me. We had good years. My company scaled up to serve executives, and I started sleeping with one eye open to risk the way a guard does in a vestibule. The kids had piano lessons and soccer, and Lauren would arrange parties where people in linen suits toasted to pending deals. I'd listen and feel proud. I thought the family and company were two pillars supporting one another. The truth is, money and appearances can hide rot. I missed the slow slide because convenience and ego blurred lines that should have been sharp. When small things went missing, receipts, passwords, offhand comments, I chalked it up to busyness and the cost of living at our level. That was a mistake. My background makes me methodical, not dramatic. When the first real sign of betrayal came, I didn't crash in the living room or throw things. I collected. I audited accounts, traced credit card records, and asked a few old colleagues to help pull what data I couldn't reach. The military taught me patience and the value of a clean case. If you want to bring down a slippery opponent, you make a file so thick you can't doubt it in court. That's what I aimed for. A pattern you can hand to a prosecutor that doesn't look like a vengeful husband's story, but like a detective's report. There are things people don't tell you about marriage and money, the quiet ways expectations shift, how being the provider can turn into being the target, and how privilege can shelter people from consequences until it can't anymore. I learned that the hard way. I also learned that family names and influence can bend the scales, but they don't make someone invisible forever. If you keep digging, patterns show where accounts move and who signed what paper. If you are patient, arrogance cracks. Now the house feels like evidence sometimes, things put back in the wrong place, a bracelet purchased on a card I never signed for distant kids who used to sprint to the door. I think about the early dinners and the first laugh we shared and how easily those moments can be used as cover for plans that have nothing to do with love. My job is to protect people from threats they don't see. This time the threat had been living with me. I used everything I had built, every skill from military days and nights at my old laptop, to map the truth, and to make sure that when the lights came on, everyone could see it. Things started changing in 2019, and it felt slow until it wasn't. Lauren, wife, stopped inviting me to the gallery openings and charity brunches we used to attend together, saying I was always busy. I thought she meant work, but the truth was she was carving space for someone else. Eric Lover showed up with that slick developer air, black BMW, sharp haircut, and a smile that opened doors. He wasn't a threat at first. He was helpful and smooth, the kind of man you assume can fix a problem before you see it. He became a fixture in our home like someone moving into a corner nobody claimed. He brought toys for Connor and Lily and classy wine for dinners that used to be quiet and real. He sat with us during weekend mornings and read the kids' funny voices while Lauren applauded. I liked him then. I told myself I did because he made the kids laugh, because he seemed smart and competent. That was the mistake I made. I let my guard down because he played the part of friend better than anyone I'd met. What worried me was the way he asked about work. His questions were casual, like a man curious at a barbecue, but they were precise. How do you handle board-level hacks? He asked once over coffee. Do you run escrow accounts differently for high-risk clients? He asked another time while picking up a toy off the floor. I answered like a man proud of his business, thinking I was giving professional insight. He listened like a friend, but I later realized he was cataloging every method and weak point I mentioned. I gave him pieces of our life without thinking of the whole. I mentioned clients we protected, the names of people who worried me, emergency protocols we ran, and how accounts were structured in case of sudden cash requirements. To me, these were technical facts, part of conversation in a company that trades in protection. To him, they were blueprints. He learned where our clients kept funds, what made our guards nervous, which contracts we would fight to keep, and which ones we might give up. He learned the patterns that let a small firm survive its first rough years. There were nights I caught odd silences between Lauren and Eric. They'd exchange glances like two people sharing a secret, and I'd feel a cold that didn't belong in our living room. Once I asked Lauren why she was so distracted, and she said, "I'm thinking about work and what's best for the kids." She used those words like a shield. Eric would laugh and say, "We can help her with that," and I'd nod because I wanted to trust them and because the kids had smiles widened by his goofy voices. The danger was in how ordinary everything looked. People who plan theft often want normal to hide their edges. Eric's questions about our company came as casual curiosity, not obvious espionage. He became a sounding board for me because he was flattering and clever. I told him about client fears and which executives I worried might leak. I told him about our escrow accounts, how we split funds to reduce risk, and the weak places in our paper trail. He took that information and folded it into plans you only see after the damage is done. Still, I would never have believed the full picture if it weren't for other signs piling up. Small purchases that weren't ours, receipts in places they shouldn't be, and a bracelet charged to an account no one in our family had authorized. When you notice patterns, you see how small things stitch together into a seam that will give. I started checking logs and bank feeds, and the numbers didn't make sense. Transfers showed up where they had no reason to be. Eric's travel increased at odd times. His name linked to development deals that suddenly had new backers and new accounts in places hard to trace. By the time clarity hit me, the map of what he'd learned was already made. He had my conversations, my trust, and my family's access. He had enough to start moving money and pieces while I still thought he was a guest. The worst part wasn't that he betrayed me. The worst part was realizing I invited him in because his charm felt like validation. When you build a business from scratch and marry someone into a life you fought for, trust is both currency and risk. I learned that in a cold, sharp way. People can sit at your table and count the forks, then leave with everything but your face. I came home after a 72-hour response in Seattle expecting relief and quiet and the small mercy of being hugged, and instead found distance like a wall pressed between us. Lauren, wife, barely looked up when I walked in and said, flat and steady, "The kids aren't used to you being home anymore." Those words landed like an accusation and a surprise. I'd been gone trying to keep a client from folding under an attack, working nights and coffee-fueled days to protect other people's companies. And somehow that made me the stranger in my own house. The kids, who used to run to the front door and climb into my arms, treated my return like a passing visit. Connor waved from the stairs like he saw a neighbor instead of his dad, and Lily gave a polite smile before ducking away. I felt hollow and alert at the same time, like a man who knows the danger is both outside and inside the walls he thinks are his. I didn't yell or slam things. Instead, I decided right then that I'd stop assuming and start documenting. My training in military intelligence made that choice easy to see. Facts before fury. I opened Lauren's laptop with her password like a man opening a file cabinet in an office he ran. I made copies of everything and started reconstructing deleted files because deleted doesn't mean gone if you know where to look. I ran recovery tools I'd used for clients, tools that pull fragments and stitch them back into readable threads. It took hours, technical work, and a cold patience, but what came back was enough to change the direction of my life. I found months of conversations that shifted from polite professional messages to something intimate and then to a plan. Photos from our bedroom appeared in the recovered cache. Angles I hadn't known were photographed and timestamps that placed them when I was halfway across the country. Messages that began with development contracts turned into late-night private jokes and then explicit arrangements. I found a folder with a name I would never have suspected holding the worst of it: Closing DocX. Inside were bullet points, timetables, and contingency plans written in a voice that was neither casual nor accidental. They'd cataloged what to say to attorneys, how to use custody fears, and which contacts to lean on to make their story believable. It was not passion, it was a transaction. My hands shook when I saw the phrase that summed it up: create narrative control audience. They had considered judges, public perception, and the sympathetic ears of family friends who could be quietly leaned on. They de-thought about my service record and how to turn it into a liability in court. They planned to say I'd become reclusive, that the surveillance I'd installed was obsessive and invasive, and that the kids were better off away from my instability. The document read like a lawyer's brief written by someone who knew emotion could be weaponized. I found bank statements linked to transfers that didn't belong to our accounts but connected to people we trusted. Eric Lover had been careful but not careful enough. He'd used shell accounts and coded labels, but patterns show up when you compare timestamps and hotel bookings. I matched transfers to nights he stayed over and purchases he'd made in my absence. The bracelet that glittered on Lauren's wrist had a paper trail that led away from our family accounts and into a place meant to disappear. Seeing those numbers with my own eyes made me cold in a different way. This was theft with a plan attached. I didn't move without a file. I built hard drives with copies of everything in duplicate and triplicate, and I hid a set in a place only I knew, beneath a false bottom in an old toolbox in the garage, under oily rags and ancient screwdrivers. I logged every step like an investigator preparing testimony, because revenge stories fail in court unless backed by proof. I texted a trusted friend in cyber forensics and asked for help verifying dates and signatures, and he replied with questions that sharpened my view of what I had to do next. I also watched Lauren and Eric more closely after that night. I placed discreet cameras and checked GPS pings on devices I could track. They met in places I'd never imagined: downtown hotel suites and a quiet cafe that served expensive coffee. I let them keep talking because arrogance makes people sloppy, confidence makes them forget they're being watched. They discussed custody strategy and timelines as if the kids were chess pieces and not small humans who would be hurt by adults' calculations. People ask whether this felt like madness. The better question was whether I felt like someone waiting to see if his house would burn down, or somebody who had matches and planned to light them only after he knew the exit. I chose method, not heat. I followed the threads, rebuilt the erased messages, and kept everything stored in ways that would stand up in court. I did it all because I had children and a company to protect, and because when betrayal hides in routine, the antidote is clear records and a slow, steady hand. I am a man who kept digging because I knew patterns hide in plain sight, and what I pulled up next changed everything. The more files I recovered from Lauren's wife devices and Eric's lover messages, the clearer their plan became. It wasn't just an affair and a few bad transfers. It was a full strategy to make me look dangerous and powerless, using my military past and the surveillance I installed for safety as the proof of my instability. They wrote scripts for sympathetic witnesses and rehearsed how to make a judge doubt me. They had that line down: play up the veteran angle, show me as obsessive, make the cameras look like weapons. I read one memo titled Narrative, Unstable Protector, where they plan to leak selective footage, twist timestamps, and claim ID violated privacy. Make sure the judge hears how invasive he is, a note said. They had people lined up to claim concern for the kids, friends who'd been coached to say I was too intense. The goal was clear: make the court see me as a threat and the kids safer with Lauren. It was a script written to flip roles. On top of the narrative, they'd planned financial hits. I found spreadsheets that read like a budget for a breakup, targeted transfers, timing to align with filings, and suggestions for subpoenas that would pull clients away. There were notes about calling certain board members and questioning our stability in boardrooms, small rumors that would grow into lost contracts. They anticipated lawsuits and prepared counterclaims meant to bleed Carter's shield dry. Start with escrow accounts, one line read, then escalate to public notices about missing funds. It felt cold to read numbers that would mean employees out of work. Then I hit the part about the Kennard family and something older and much darker. In a folder labeled Kennard 2009, there were scanned pages from a sealed case file that should never have been within reach. It documented a hit and run from 2009 that killed a working-class family returning from a birthday. The file listed witnesses who had been interviewed and then quietly shelved. It recorded calls asking law enforcement to back off and donations that coincided with dates when witness statements went missing. I stared at the scan and felt my stomach drop because this wasn't just about money or divorce. It was about a life taken and the system being bent to hide it. The documents showed the Kennard son had been treated with a hand so soft it read like protection, a private program for a few months instead of criminal charges, a settlement arranged in hushed rooms, and silence bought with favors and money. There were notes that suggested intimidation tactics used on anyone who pushed too hard, calls from political allies, pressures on the DA, and a link back to campaign donations that lined up suspiciously with when official interest evaporated. "Keep it internal," one handwritten note read, and that handwriting matched several letters in Lauren's files. I realized then that her family had used influence to close the case. I felt a complicated mix of anger and obligation. This was leverage, sure, but it was also a duty. I thought about the family who died and how their relatives had been denied justice for a decade. I thought about the Kennard name carrying weight through courtrooms and news cycles, and how that weight had been used as armor. My plan changed from protecting myself and my business to exposing a shield built on other people's grief. I couldn't let greed and reputation be the final verdict for an innocent family. So I kept building the file. I cross-checked dates, matched bank transfers to hotel stays, and pulled public records to show connections between donations and case delays. I copied everything into drives stored in separate places and labeled them with the care of someone who knows how fragile evidence can be. I called a trusted former colleague at the federal level and asked, "Do you want to look at something that ties influence to obstruction?" He said yes without hesitation. That call felt like a bridge from private proof to public action. I didn't sleep much those nights. I read through interviews and counsel notes and started to imagine how this would land in an investigator's hands. A timeline that linked the Kennard intervention to the dropped charges, a paper trail showing payments that coincided with silence, and the modern evidence of Lauren and Eric's scheme layered on top. I knew exposing it would hurt reputations and burn bridges, but hiding it would be a decision to let injustice stand. I decided then that I would do the slow, boring legal work to make sure the truth mattered in a courtroom, and not just at my kitchen table. I shifted from defense to offense the night I realized they had a timeline and I was on it, because watching your life get scheduled for ruin makes you move. I started with the house, the place that had become a map of their lives, and put discreet cameras where they wouldn't notice. A lamp in the living room, a picture frame on the mantle, a buggy little button camera in the kids' playroom. I also put audio devices in places where they whispered and thought only themselves heard. It felt invasive, but I kept thinking about the kids and the job of protecting them even when the threat wore familiar faces. I slipped a small GPS tracker onto the bracelet Eric Lover had given Lauren wife like it was another piece of jewelry. It sat warm against her wrist and it told me where she went when she said she was working late. The tracker gave me stops at downtown hotels, a few long drives late at night, and the Grand Meridian suite where they sounded like they'd already won. I watched the dots on a map and matched them to bank transfers, hotel bills, and phone pings, until their world looked like a series of lines I could follow. Eric's phone password proved to be the kind of arrogance that gets people caught. His birth date, February 2nd, the same pattern men use when they think no one will bother to try. I cracked it in 5 minutes and felt the old, cold satisfaction of someone who knows how to get inside a locked room. Inside the phone were messages that read like a playbook. He'd been moving money in smart, small increments, pushing funds through shell companies and accounts in jurisdictions meant to be hard to trace. The numbers added up fast. Nearly $401,000 moved out in a few months. There were screenshots of transfers to accounts in places named with soft vowels and empty regulations, places you read about in articles where people stash things they don't want found. There were notes about timing to move the money, file the papers, freeze the company long enough for panic to break contracts, then finish with a clean slip away. I found booking confirmations too, a one-way first-class ticket to Monaco for the week right after Lauren planned to file custody papers. He'd bought it like a man laying out an escape route, one he expected never to have to use because their plan to break me in court would leave them rich enough. Their plan was simple and cruel. Make me look unhinged in front of a judge, take custody leverage, demand a big cut of Carter's shield, and leave me with the wreckage while Eric vanished with the money. I read one message where Eric typed, "We split it, she keeps the house, I disappear, nobody asks why." Lauren replied with a laughing face emoji and a note about timing. That casualness made my skin crawl, the way they treated children and livelihoods as numbers on a spreadsheet. I did not move publicly. I kept collecting and cataloging because the better play was to make sure what I had would survive legal scrutiny. I duplicated drives, encrypted files, and put copies with trusted friends in other states. I contacted an old buddy in federal financial crimes and fed him the clean pieces, hotel receipts, transfers, Gideon-style timelines that would make sense to an investigator. I didn't want this to smell like a husband's revenge. I wanted prosecutors to see a pattern of theft and conspiracy that a jury could understand. Sometimes I let myself be the angry man for a minute and pictured confronting them, but then I reminded myself of the other thing. If I lost my temper, I'd give them the narrative they wanted. I kept recording, let them keep speaking, and waited for the arrogance to do the rest. When Eric bragged about moving money or Lauren sighed about the judge being on our side, I marked it down. I knew pride makes people sloppy. It makes them reuse passwords and book tickets without thinking about the paper trail. Their arrogance became my map. When the first freeze came from federal contacts a few days later, it wasn't luck. It was the kind of slow, patient work my old teams used on bigger threats. They saw the transfers, the booking, and the same hotel names tied to accounts. I watched as agencies took the threads I'd pulled and began to weave them into a legal net. It wasn't quick justice, but it was the kind that lasts. I had turned my training and my pain into something surgical, evidence that would show not just betrayal, but calculated theft and escape plans meant to leave my family in the ruins. He slid the packet across the mahogany desk like he expected me to fold, demanding full custody, the house, most of Carter's shield, and a monthly payout that would ruin me. I stared at the pages for a beat, then placed a manila envelope on top of his expensive wood like it was more honest currency. Inside were the things that mattered: hotel photos of Lauren, wife, and Eric, lover, in Suite 3211, bank transfers mapped to dates and nights they were together, invoices from the Grand Meridian that matched timestamps, and the reconstructed sealed case files showing how the Kennards bought silence after that fatal crash in 2009. I watched the lawyer's face change the way a light switches after someone flips it on. He scoffed at first, then flipped through the images and the spreadsheets, the silence in the room growing heavy enough to sit on. "This is extortion," he said, but he didn't push the packet back. He read the pages about the transfers and the emails that linked Eric to shell accounts, and he read the notes that tied the Kennard donations to meetings that coincided with witnesses going quiet. I kept my voice flat because drama doesn't help a case. "Deliver them to your client," I told him. "Tell her the alternative is public exposure and a federal inquiry." 6 hours later, Lauren called, voice frayed like someone on the edge of falling apart. She spoke fast, part pleading and part threat, like someone who still believed influence would catch her. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, breathy and sharp at once. "My family will ruin you." I let her say it, and then I told her exactly what I wanted. "Withdraw the petition, sign over custody to me, make Eric return the money and leave our lives, and have your mother resign the bench. Do it before I go to the FBI and press everything." She went quiet for 20 seconds like someone trying to remember how power works when it looks exposed. I heard Eric on her feed when he called from a private number, a brittle voice full of threats and bravado that crumbled once I named bank amounts and transfers. He swore and hung up, but I tracked him through his patterns: a car leaving town, a check-in at an airport terminal, and then nothing. He cleared their joint accounts like a man burning a bridge behind him and boarded a flight to Paris the same night. He'd meant to be gone before anyone could breathe. A clean exit plan for a man who thought money could wipe guilt. I didn't panic. I called an old contact at the Financial Crimes Unit and handed over the clean pieces of the puzzle: account numbers, transaction screenshots, hotel invoices, and the flight itinerary. "Freeze whatever you can," I said plainly. I knew federal systems move differently than private men's hands, but they move with a kind of finality that mattered. Within hours, assets were being flagged and held. When Eric tried to move more money at a Paris airport, the trap I'd helped set with federal agents snapped shut. He was detained by authorities there and later extradited, making the kind of headlines his arrogance had assumed he was immune from. The fallout was immediate and loud in the quietest way. Once federal eyes turned toward the accounts, subpoenas went out and lawyers who'd hoped to steer narratives started calling their clients with worried voices. People who thought their names were scars in velvet suddenly realized the fabric was unraveling. The Kennard influence that once smoothed problems into corners didn't vanish, but it didn't stop investigators either. The sealed 2009 files I'd handed over were a match to the timing of donations and a pattern that a prosecutor could follow. The system moved like a machine that takes time, but it takes it away from those who thought they controlled the tempo. When the dust settled enough to see outlines, Lauren's calls became less threatening and more pleading. She asked for mercy in small, clipped sentences and offered things like apologies and promises I knew had no weight. I kept my list and crossed things off only when I had verifiable proof of action. Custody papers filed, Eric ordered to return funds, and a resignation letter from a bench that had long been a protective shield. I watched as the Kennard name slid from glossy donor lists to investigation files. Public perception shifted in small measures, then in waves. I didn't celebrate. This wasn't about gloating over a fallen enemy. It was about making sure my children had a home, my employees had paychecks, and the truth got a chance to matter. I'd put together a file thick enough that prosecutors could see the line from casual charm to calculated theft, and that line led straight to people who had thought money was a shield. Justice wasn't immediate, but it was intentional. And in the long wake of what they tried to do, I found a kind of tired steadiness that said, "We will rebuild." The fallout hit like the calm after a storm that keeps knocking things off the porch, everything rearranged and nothing quiet. Lawrence Hart, lawyer, folded when the weight on his desk stopped being a threat and started being proof. He got Lauren, wife, to sign a custody transfer giving me sole parental rights, and the financial settlement he pushed for shrank to a fraction of what he demanded at first. I remember the moment I saw the signed papers. It felt less like victory and more like the clearing of rubble so we could breathe without falling apart. Chief Judge Ellen Kennard, mother-in-law, announced her retirement the same week as the custody papers. She called it personal reasons, but everyone knew why. Once prosecutors began pulling at the threads the Kennard family had woven around that 2009 crash, the fabric wouldn't hold. They reopened the sealed files and moved with a kind of steady patience that made power look small. The investigators matched donations to delays and recorded calls that used influence to shut down witnesses. When evidence points where it points, even names with weight have to answer. Prosecutors charged family members with obstruction and crimes related to the crash. The case that had been quiet for a decade turned loud enough to unseat careers. Senator Alan Kennard, father-in-law, imploded under the pressure. Calls for resignation, media stories, and investigations into campaign funds tied to the delays. He stepped down and withdrew from re-election, and the Kennard name changed in ways money couldn't fix. It was a reminder that reputations can be a kind of brittle armor. Someone smart enough to buy silence once might not be smart enough to escape a slow, legal unraveling. Eric Lover didn't get to spend his ill-gotten money in Monaco. He made a plea deal, federal time in exchange for returning what he could and testifying where he had to. He went to prison and the world he thought would shelter him closed its gates. Lauren lost most of what mattered to her in that world. Her development firm collapsed, clients left, and social circles that once opened doors shut them hard. She traded a life many envy for a small office and a smaller bank account. Everyone has to live with the choices they make. Hers were expensive. Carter Shield didn't die. It breathed through the worst because I had people who believed in the work and because clients respected how I handled the threat. We rebuilt stronger and with clearer rules. We tightened protocols, changed how we handle escrow, and trained staff to spot charm that hides calculation. We went from 14 employees to 31 and revenue rose, but the numbers mattered less to me than what the numbers bought. Security for families and paychecks for people who trusted me. That shift in purpose felt more real than any contract. The biggest change, and the one that made everything else worth it, was at home. Connor and Lily are with me full-time now, and their small, loud lives fill the house in a way spreadsheets never did. Saturday mornings are for pancakes, not contracts. Bedtime is for stories, not last-minute client calls. I coach Connor's team and sit with Lily while she paints, and I ask myself before every choice, what's best for the kids? It's a simple question that rearranged priorities overnight. The company follows the family now, not the other way around. People sometimes ask if I wanted revenge. My answer is always the same: no, I wanted justice and safety. Revenge burns a lot and leaves little behind. Justice, slow and patient, rebuilt safety for my kids and kept my company alive. The records I built and the patience I used meant prosecutors could do their work and people could be held accountable for choices that hurt other people. That mattered more than watching someone I once loved fall. I carry the weight of all of it every day, the betrayal and the rebuild, but I try to turn that weight into steady steps. I still notice patterns. That's wired into me from the service and the business. Now those patterns help me create routines that keep my kids safe and my employees paid. I don't pretend the past isn't messy. It is. But in the mess, I found a reason to be methodical instead of loud, and that steadiness saved the things I care about most. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.